I guarantee you're making at least one of these squat mistakes, and we're going to pick apart these lifter squats so you don't make the same mistake in your own training. If you'd like to take the thinking out of your own programming, check out the Sika Strength app in the link below. 2 squat programs are currently on the app, the RTA 1 and 2. They're wildly successful. The front squat program is nearly ready to go up on the app, and the low bar squat program is in the process of being made. Also, the anti-glass back program will be put up alongside the front squat program when they're uploaded to the app. Check it out in the link below. First up, we've got Henry. Now, Henry has an interesting problem here in the fact that he is standing too wide. But interestingly, Henry is actually very, very mobile. So even though he's standing too wide and it's a suboptimal position for him to produce enough force to squat the weight sufficiently, on this 180 kilo back squat fail, he has very good mobility in the bottom position. So you'll see as he squats down, you'll see when he hits that bottom position, you'll see he's actually in a maybe not a decent position, but he's at good end ranges of motion. It's a very, very deep squat when he's in this wide position. So what's the problem, and why is he missing this squat at 180 kilos, or what's contributing to that? When we have too wide a squat position, what happens is, even if we are mobile, like Henry, and he's a great example for this, is that even though he has sufficient ankle mobility, or at least it looks like that, and even though he has certainly a lot of internal rotation in his hips available to him, he's still in a very compromised position at the bottom of the squat. And so when we reach this above parallel position, he is almost essentially forced to come into this internally rotated position, or his knees coming in at the hardest point of the squat for everyone. This is everyone's sticking point by and large. And so if we begin the squat with too wide a stance, unless we've got extreme levels of external rotation, unless we have this hip structure and this power like someone like Toshiki Yamamoto, which hopefully some of you know, most of us just aren't going to be able to open up our hips, push our knees out to hit a adequate position here where we can still have those knees in a position where they're driving over the toes. Now, my problem with knee valgus isn't a knee issue. It's not, if we want to call it knee collapse, if some of you don't want to call it knee valgus, I don't particularly mind. It's the fact that this almost always pushes the hips back once we get above parallel. So even if you have sufficient mobility, like Henry does, we know he's got good mobility, what'll tend to happen is that the knees will always shift back. As they collapse inwards, the hips will shift back, the barbell will move forward, we'll reduce the engagement of our legs, and that's what we're trying to do in the back squat, is use our legs to the best possible way we can do that. So what we need from Henry is to bring his feet in closer. So even if you're very, very mobile, even if you're someone who has sufficient mobility available to you to squat the weight, you still need to obviously be in a powerful position. So what we want to do here is bring the feet in about the width, or at least half the width of his feet closer either side. I would keep the same rack position, keep the same toe angle. And what we need is those feet, let's say at the moment the heels are about shoulder width or slightly outside that. I would like to see the toes at approximately shoulder width. So if we're imagining the joint position here is what will take his shoulder width. In this position, he won't need to force his knees out. This should keep his knees and his toes tracking quite well through the squat. So when he gets to the bottom position, he's in this position where he is approximately knee and toe are in line. And so when he gets to this harder position above parallel, his feet and his knees will be approximately in line with each other, and as a result this should be a more powerful position to drive from, because in the high bar squat the knee extensors are the primary part of that squat, the primary driver of the knees and the hips and the stand up. So when we're extending here, we want to make sure that the feet and the knees are in the best line generally to give us the most optimal position, or the most powerful position to finish the squat. When we look at this squat, right, to me, I'm not sure this would pass in depth in terms of powerlifting competition. Now, I know we're not in a powerlifting competition. It might be the angle, but I suppose if we take colloquially what we take as a squat as the hip crease below the line of the knee, even culturally between YouTube people, when we're looking at this, to me, this looks like borderline it might pass, but in some federations it wouldn't. What I'll be looking at here, so let's take the assumption that this won't pass for squat depth, and obviously when we're doing PBs, even if they're in training, even if he doesn't compete, which I don't think he does, we're still going to be in a position where we want stuff to meet a certain criteria. You know, for benching, we want the bench to touch our chest and reach arm's length. There's things we understand when we say squatting. Now, I'm not including this just to talk about depth. There's no point talking about depth unless we have a rational reason for talking about this. And this is a common problem for people who are quite well built for squatting. Now, I know there's some of you listening to this, and you're like those rich people that say money doesn't make you happy when you can't afford to pay your bills. Talking about someone who's well built for squatting And then talking about the positions is probably pretty patronizing to some of you, but it is an important position because there's lots of you watching who might be well built for squatting. The issue here is that generally when we're well built for squatting, we've got these fat knees, we've got these big quads, we've got big hamstrings, big glutes. When we get to the bottom of our squat, with a stance that's slightly too narrow, we end up really well stacked over our calf and our hamstring, and it feels really good, and we feel like we're in a really powerful position. But what happens is this does limit the depth a little bit unless you're super mobile, unless you have got a little bit more room in those hips or knees or ankles, I should say, to push that a little bit further forward. So what he would need to be doing here is actually just standing just a slight little bit wider. Now, the interesting thing is it looks like he's actually got heel shoes on. They appear to be some kind of Reebok. Are they the Reebok PBs? They actually have a little bit of a heel lift. So this actually does make it a slight bit harder, because when we end up with the knees really far forward, we also sometimes end up with more of that stacking happening, and as a result then we end up with that appearance of not being able to get any lower. Now in this position he possibly can't get any deeper. So I know what you're saying there. You're saying, okay, so it sounds like if he had more mobility he could reach it, but with the shoes on it sounds like he's almost reaching that point. So again, if he had shoes on but a little bit extra mobility, he'd be able to push further into that, so he'd sit deeper, if you can imagine what I'm saying. So I just want to be clear in that position. Without heel shoes he'd be able to reach depth that would look like that, because he would sit a little bit further back. This would push his hips down a little bit lower, even though he mightn't be quite as upright. Now he mightn't necessarily be able to squat this weight with that technique, but that is one option. However, what I would be saying here is keep the same shoes and stand a little bit wider. So what this does then is give the hips more room to sit in between the heels, and this would also give him a better opportunity in the fact that you can see he slightly leans forward as he begins the ascent. This is probably back strength, what I would say here. So you can see the line of his knee is driving quite well. His knees are staying forward, as people who are well built for squatting are wont to do. Lucky them. Lucky I should say. But the issue then is that the back is usually going to take the brunt of the load, and certainly the upper back. So in this rounding, we're seeing more flexion in upper back. And I don't think, looking at it from this angle, we're necessarily in a positional error, although we could be. I can't see the wrists. But oftentimes, this is a weakness issue. This is something I've experienced myself. Guess what the prescription for this is? Testosterone. I'm joking. It's lots of upper back work and lower back work. So steel rows, horizontal rows, weighted pull-ups, barbell rows, rear delt flies, straight arm lat pull downs, weighted back extensions, weighted back extension holds. Get more core work in to fix that upper back problem on top of that. Miller has a coordination issue. This is, again, really common error. So if we watch the start of the squat, by and large, I'm happy at that rack position. Elbows approximately 45 degrees with, if we were to draw a line straight down from the barbell, this would approximately be 45 degrees, good position. Wrists are solid. We could see a bit more extension if we wanted to, but I'm not majorly concerned. Back looks to be like he's keeping it quite tight, so it looks like he's pinching it, but you can see what immediately begins to happen. As soon as he begins to squat, he's already pushing the shoulders forward and the hips slightly back. So sometimes people misconstrue this when we talk about this as a desire that everyone has to squat upright as possible all the time. Everyone always has to be in a position where they're the most vertical, most perfect squat ever. No, that's never what we're talking about, and we've never said that either. What we always want to see is no change, or as little change as possible in the back and the back angle as you can possibly manage once you begin the squat. So whether you're starting with a high bar position, a mid bar position, or a low bar position, whatever angle you begin at the start of the squat, ideally we want to aim to keep that as much as possible. So what's happening here is that Nathan is beginning the squat by immediately letting the chest come forward. Super common issue. On top of that then, what happens is the elbows begin tracking forward. This separates the shoulder blades. This adds more flexion to the upper back. And as a result then, when weights get heavier, we're going to end up seeing this position get worse. The elbows will come forward more. We'll see more rounding of the upper back. And then as a result, we're going to start missing squats forward. So how does he fix this? First of all, we're just looking at keeping the chest up as he begins the squat and actually focusing on keeping the chest in that really high up position. If any of you remember the video we did with Toshiki in Japan a couple of years ago, where he got me to focus on this more, it's a very common problem, is even if you're experienced with squatting, a lot of us will start with the best of intentions, but as soon as we begin the squat, we'll immediately let our chest drop. you can keep it up. He definitely has sufficient mobility. I'm pretty happy with the start position. So what Nathan needs to do, you can even see he gets a little bit tighter here, but what begins to happen as soon as he squats forward, the hips move back and the chest falls forward. So what we need to work on here is keeping that chest up, and for Nathan is to keep the hips going straight down. Technically, I'm actually quite happy with this. So this is one of those cases where for me, the knee valgus isn't a major issue. So if we just touch on this while we see it, so bottom position is good, but as he squats up, you'll see even though the knees are moving forward, the hips don't shift back, or even though the knees are moving in, the hips don't shift back correspondingly. So I'm not anti-knee valgus all the time. Do I prefer if the knee valgus happens less or not at all for most people squatting? Absolutely. But I'm not saying that it's definitely going to be the worst position, but for most people, it's preferable if you don't have that, because eventually you're going to meet that point where the hips will shift back. So what I really want to touch on in this squat is actually the slow tempo. So I'm a fan, if you're really experienced, of squatting a little bit faster for the most part. Now, this speed will vary depending on the lifter. Some powerlifters will, even in the low bar, absolutely dive bomb to that precise depth and hit the squat. Some weightlifters will do it too, but some people will really feel out the squatting positions. Now, you might say, Owen, if he made a successful rep in his PB, is he not going to be in a position where this is good technique? So remember, we're always looking at what might happen as weights get heavier. So unless you've hit your ultimate all-time PB, we need to be looking at technique of, will this serve us in 10, 15 or 50 kilos time? And usually what happens is that if we squat down a little bit too slow, a little bit too tentatively, what will generally happen is we're not going to be able to supply sufficient force to the barbell. So when we're high bar squatting like this, or even low bar squatting, we want to make use of the stretch shortening cycle, this neurological phenomenon, which essentially means you can produce more force, or you can put more force into the barbell. And when weights get heavier, and let me tell you, they get heavier. Usually if you're in this bracket, 200 to 220 will feel quite similar. 230 to 220 again is still quite similar, but once the first time you put 240 on a barbell is when you'll start to realize that you'll think, oh, there is brackets to these weights. So we want to here is actually work on getting the speed up a little bit faster, but still keeping the same positions. So positions are good. Knee valgus aside, I actually suspect you'd probably see a little bit less if we sped up that squat a little bit. So what I'm looking at here is a slightly faster descent. On top of that, as a weightlifter, we also want to be moving weights a little bit quicker if we can. It does train some good attributes for the sport. Remember, it's a speed strength sport. So if we can make more power when we're squatting, essentially that power value, work done per unit of time, then I would like to see it, that would benefit us a little bit more in weightlifting. So from here, I would just like to see, can we increase that speed just a little bit? So remember, not all critiques are massive technical errors. Sometimes they're serviceable errors. So this is a 160 kilo back squat, and I'm going to give a little bit of a quick critique on this one, and it's the fact that sometimes more strength training will make us better. So you might be kind of wondering what I'm talking about or what's actually going on here. So technically, I'm pretty happy with everything on this back squat. I'm assuming this back squat is a PB or is very, very close to the PB for this lifter. But there's an interesting thing, and sometimes in strength training, all we need to do is keep training. Sometimes everything is fine and we'll just improve as we get more familiar with strength training. So strength training is physiological adaptations, it's psychological adaptations, and it's also a lot of skill work, which I suppose is a combination of physiological and psychological. But a lot of times it's familiarity and repetition and repeating strength training. And strength training takes years upon years. So what would improve the quality of this squat, not necessarily is a change in any position, but for this lifter is actually just keep strength training. Hopefully that's a little mid-break motivational one for you, because we're about to start harassing more people. So we can see here, he's a newer lifter. He's squatting something like 70 or 80 kilos. And we can see him squatting with a hip circle around his knees. Now, I'm not against the hip circle in all scenarios. Sometimes the hip circle can be useful. It can be useful for a rehab issue. It can be useful for working on certain aspects of technique. But for newer lifters, I don't like to see a hip circle. The reason for this is because we're learning a pattern where we're driving our knees out. And the issue is that you need to know how much to push those knees out. So the goal when we're high bar squatting like this is knees tracking in line with the toe direction. So whatever direction your feet are approximately pointing, I want the knees tracking in that line. So for experienced lifters, You'll have a really good understanding of this intuitively after a lot of repetitions, and you'll probably have a good understanding of where your knees are going when you're squatting. And so if you need to use a hip circle for rehab issues, or there really is a major knee valgus problem, you find that this might help at you, then you're probably going to be okay. But the issue with a hip circle as a newer lifter is the fact that we're going to ingrain a pattern that we don't want. We don't want knees going really far out, certainly not at least in the high bar squat or even the general strength training squat that we're seeing here, which is aka not a low bar squat for a powerlifting competition. We want those knees tracking forward over the toes. Now, this doesn't mean that we're necessarily the most upright and perfect. We might have still some rearward hip descent, which is also okay depending on the lifter. But the issue with a hip circle is that we're training ourselves to push those knees out a lot to make room for the hips. And in the warm-up, this might be okay, but doing actual sets and reps with the hip circle isn't something we're huge fans of. So for this case, for Gord, I would say learn to squat more without that hip circle and see if we can practice the pattern. Again, some issues need direct change, some issues need interventions with strength training aspects or isolation work, but in this case, it's simply more strength training, practice the movement, get rid of the hip circle, you'll be in a good position. Has something that's, again, not necessarily a major problem at the weight he's sent here. This 110 kilos is decently solid, but the major issue I want you to look at is his wrist position and elbow position. So this is a great example of something that I don't like. A vertical elbow position is really detrimental to most lifters. Now, I know you might see or point to some lifters like maybe John Hack or Peter Asanoyak in the weightlifting world where they'll have a super vertical elbow position, but those lifters are freaks of nature. They have absolutely ridiculous upper back strength. For example, John Hack obviously has a 430 odd kilo deadlift. Peter Asanoyak has snatched 180 kilos, clean and jerk like 225. They're strong lifters. But for the rest of us, what this vertical elbow position usually does, especially with this almost extended wrist position, is force the upper back to take the direction of the force and open up a little bit more as we're squatting. So usually what will happen is when people have really vertical elbows, the elbows will move further forward as they begin squatting, which you can see a little bit here. We can also see this really loose grip, and generally a loose grip lets me know is that the upper back isn't as tight as it could be, because when we're bracing that upper back, usually the hands will want to stay tight with that, or at the very least a tighter grip on the barbell will also include or help improve the tightness of the upper back position. So if we don't have a tight grip and we have a vertical elbow position, we'll know that that upper back is going to be the weak link here, and we can even see that as the reps get a little bit heavier, that the upper back is going to take a bit more of the brunt. And while this weight is a little bit lighter, I can guarantee you that as we add 10 or 20 kilos here, we're going to see more rounding and flexion in that upper back, and that is no bueno. A very long limbed lifter, someone who's maybe not quite amazingly well built for squatting, and he's doing a low bar squat. Now, he's actually got very good mobility, which is the first step in conquering the squat if you're trying to squat as someone who's not the most perfect, amazing build for squatting, which is fine. What I would like to see here is this is a case for weightlifting shoes. So again, touching on the point that I don't need to see the most perfect upright squat ever. That's not what we're looking for when we're squatting. Certainly not even when we're low bar squatting. But what I do need to see is a consistent back angle. From what we've seen from a lot of lifters, especially in the low bar squat, we don't want the hips leading. The hips leading always leads to a pattern of a good morning style squat where we're going to be leaning forward a little bit more. So if we look at it from the side, if we look at the angle he's at here, we can see that hip is slightly pushed back. We've got a little bit of that lower back extension, which is perfect. I think the rack position itself is fine. The descent is good. He's pushing his knees forward to his max ability now, and his hips are going back at the same time. The timing there is actually quite good. But unfortunately, due to his leverages, he is in a position where he's going to be destined to have this hip really far behind not only the bar, but even behind these heels. Guess what would be a great addition here? A pair of weightlifting shoes. Don't use squat boards. I don't like the squat wedges. They're kind of a tripping hazard. It's hard to be consistent with them. You have to carry them around with you. It's a little bit easier to bring shoes. Shoes are always the same size, the same angle, and the same position. So for here, I would be looking at getting the cheapest possible pair of weightlifting shoes, and this will give him the ability to push those knees a little bit further forward. As a result, the hips will come further forward with that, and as a result, it will give him a more consistent back angle. Remember, I'm not saying the most upright back angle, I'm just saying the most consistent back angle. So from here, a pair of weightlifting shoes would put him in a very well-served position, because he's got good mobility, he's good technique. It's just that he's at a position where he's going to be blocked by the lack of weightlifting shoes. You can even see his knees stay forward quite well and he's got the mobility, but unfortunately he's just at the position where he needs a little bit of mechanical advantage. Okay, I hope you enjoyed today's critique. I very much enjoy doing these. If you missed the submissions for this video, we will be sending them out again probably next month. Keep an eye on Instagram and the YouTube community posts. Again, if you want to run our squat programs, they're incredibly successful. The RTA 1 is almost infamous in how difficult it is, but how attainable it is to hit massive PBs. Check it out in the link below. The first one is 8 weeks. The RTA 2.0 is 12 weeks. The front squat program will be 12 weeks also. The anti-glass back program will be a little bit longer. If you're looking to get stronger in the anterior and the posterior, a combination of those could be very, very valuable, or running of those consecutively. In the link down below, you get 2 programs active at any time. You can switch between any programs throughout the month. It's a great value for your money. AI chatbot, you get access to obviously all the programs in the library, a video library alongside that, our expert programming on top of that as well. Check it out in the link below.